Chapter 11. He didn't run, and that was the first thing that surprised them. 4 years of chasing a ghost, and when Salvadoran police finally had Pedro Antonio Andrade in a chair, he didn't rage or deny or demand a lawyer. He looked at the men across the table with the steady eyes of someone who had spent a long time thinking about this moment, who had, in some sense, been preparing for it, since the night he watched a white Toyota pickup disappear into the streets of San Salvador with a wounded man in the bed and 4 American Marines dying on the pavement behind it. He looked at them the way a man looks at something he has already decided how to handle, and he told them who he was. Pedro Antonio Andrade, alias Mario Gonzalez, head of the Mardoqueo Cruz Urban Commando. Then he folded his hands on the table and waited for them to make the next move. Inside the PRTC, the name Mario had carried genuine weight, not the hollow authority of a title conferred by rank, but the real currency of a man who had planned operations that worked, who had built networks that held under pressure, who had looked at a strip of restaurants along Boulevard del Hipódromo and seen something his commanders had not fully articulated, not simply a place where Americans gathered, but a place where Americans gathered without expecting to die. The psychological geography of the Zona Rosa was the insight. The attack was the execution. He had turned that observation into an operation precise enough to kill 4 Marines, wound 9 others, and generate headlines on 2 continents. And then he had walked away from it and dissolved into an alias so completely that for 4 years the most sophisticated intelligence apparatus in the Western Hemisphere had been hunting a name without a face, a voice without a body, a commander known to his own fighters primarily as a presence that planned things and then disappeared. He had been arrested on charges unrelated to the Zona Rosa entirely, which was either the cruelest irony the case had yet produced or simply the way clandestine careers tend to end, not in the moment of maximum exposure, but in some quieter sideways collision with the ordinary machinery of law enforcement that no amount of operational discipline can indefinitely avoid. The CIA station in San Salvador moved within hours of learning who was in custody. By May 31st, 72 hours after his arrest, the station had already run the loop to Langley and back, pulling everything they had on Andrade and building an assessment that moved up the chain with unusual speed. Their findings were unambiguous. In those 3 days alone, Andrade had already led Salvadoran authorities to the largest single cache of guerrilla weapons recovered during the entire insurgency. Not a cache. The cache. Everything the PRTC had buried, stockpiled, and pre-positioned across the capital over years of patient preparation surfaced in 72 hours because Andrade had decided, with the same operational precision he had applied to everything else in his career, that it was time to be cooperative. He hadn't been broken. He hadn't been threatened into it. He had made a calculation about what cooperation was worth to him and acted on it, which told the CIA station everything they needed to know about who they were actually dealing with. He wasn't a field operative carrying narrow knowledge of a single attack. He was a senior architect of the PRTC's urban apparatus, a man who understood how the cells were organized, where the remaining arms were hidden, how orders moved through the network without leaving traces, who reported to whom and what the next operation looked like before it had acquired a name. He carried inside him the internal mechanics of a clandestine structure that American and Salvadoran intelligence had spent years and enormous resources trying to penetrate from the outside and had never fully mapped. And he was now sitting in a room in San Salvador under arrest, apparently willing to talk, the kind of source that appears once in a generation, if at all, and only under circumstances this specific and this unlikely. The Department of Justice arrived at an entirely different conclusion. To the prosecutors who had been building the Zona Rosa case since the summer of 1985, who had sat through the early confessions in the hot rooms of the Salvadoran investigative apparatus, through the amnesty ruling and Duarte's intervention, through 4 years of grinding procedural delay in courts that moved with the unhurried patience of institutions under no particular pressure to produce results, Andrade was not a windfall and not an asset. He was the man who had planned the murder of 4 United States Marines, who had stood at the operational center of the worst terrorist attack on American diplomatic personnel in Central American history, and who had subsequently spent 4 years living under an alias while the investigation ground itself down trying to find him. In early June, a Justice Department attorney flew to San Salvador. The interview was arranged through the embassy's legal officer, with Salvadoran authorities present, and the CIA station received explicit instructions from headquarters that carried the weight of a decision already made at levels above the room. Stay entirely out of the evidence-gathering process. Do not insert yourself into the prosecutorial lane. Let the DOJ team work. Andrade sat across from them and gave them almost nothing, and he did it with a composure that the prosecutors in the room would later struggle to adequately describe. He acknowledged that he had played a role in the Zona Rosa operation, delivered the phrase with the careful, almost surgical neutrality of a man who understood exactly how much prosecutorial weight each word carried, precise enough to suggest candor, elastic enough to mean anything a competent defense attorney might later need it to mean. When FBI personnel conducted follow-up interviews, he retreated further into the same controlled territory, offering information about FMLN operations with obvious intelligence value, feeding one part of the American appetite in the room while carefully starving the other. He was giving enough to remain valuable, not enough to place himself in a courtroom. He had spent years teaching others how to survive exactly this kind of interrogation, how to read the men across the table, how to identify what each of them needed and offer just enough of it to stay useful without crossing the line that would make him expendable, and he was demonstrably better at it than anyone the American government had sent to question him. Salvadoran investigators strapped him to a polygraph in July 1989, then a second time when the first result came back inconclusive. The analysts noted, with the careful professional hedging of people who understood exactly what the notation meant for the case, a tentative indication that his denials might have been truthful. The second examination settled into the same uncertain territory. A CIA polygrapher reviewed both sets of results and added a notation that would quietly devastate whatever prosecutorial momentum remained. Andrade had been recovering from a cold during the first examination, and under standard professional protocols, the test should have been postponed before it was administered. The results were therefore compromised in ways that made them unreliable in either direction, neither a confirmation of guilt nor a clean exoneration, simply a document that a defense attorney could use to introduce reasonable doubt into a case that was already struggling to establish proof beyond it. 4 years of investigation, 2 governments, the full weight of American prosecutorial intent brought to bear on a single man in a single room, and a cold had muddied the only forensic tool they had left. The prosecutors had flown to San Salvador expecting a confession or a break decisive enough to finally move the case into a federal courtroom. They were leaving with something considerably harder to work with than a denial. They were leaving with ambiguity, with the legal vertigo of near certainty about a man who had nonetheless managed to position himself just outside the edge of provable guilt. Andrade understood this with a clarity that was visible to everyone in the room, even when he said nothing, which was often. He had understood it, most likely, before they landed. What had developed in that room in San Salvador was a standoff that neither side could resolve without cost. The CIA wanted his knowledge of the PRTC's urban network, its arms pipelines, its command architecture, its surviving personnel, the future operations he might know about or could help prevent. The Justice Department wanted him in a federal courtroom, under oath, answering for 4 dead Marines and the families who had buried them. Neither could fully have him without destroying what the other needed, and Andrade, who had built his entire career on the study of what institutions wanted and the precise calibration of how much to give them, was watching both sides of the American government pull against each other with the patience of a man who had been preparing for this negotiation since long before anyone in that room knew his real name. He had constructed a clandestine network inside a capital city and run it for years without detection. He had planned and executed one of the most notorious attacks of the Salvadoran Civil War, and then vanished so thoroughly that his alias had become a kind of legend among the people hunting him. He had done all of this while remaining, to the outside world, invisible. The men across the table were skilled and experienced and almost entirely certain of his guilt, and they were working with the full institutional resources of the United States government behind them. Whatever came next, none of them were going to outmaneuver him easily. And somewhere behind those steady eyes, Pedro Antonio Andrade already knew it. Chapter 15. They called it justice. They said so in press conferences and encrypted cables and internal memos, often enough and seriously enough that the word began to acquire the weight of policy. It wasn't policy. Garcia Melendez had slipped across a border he had no business crossing and handed investigators the break they needed, and been deported and charged for it. The reward money may never have found him. The men he identified were in cells, but the man who had planned everything was negotiating his intelligence value from a chair in San Salvador. Each of these outcomes had its own explanation. Taken one at a time, each could be rationalized. Laid together, they formed a pattern. His name was Andrade. He was not the only one, but he was the clearest case. The place where the logic of what was actually happening became impossible to look away from, for anyone willing to look. Andrade had intelligence value. The phrase appeared in the internal deliberations, the interagency cables, the careful negotiations between the prosecutors who wanted to charge him and the intelligence officers who wanted to keep him. It was a bloodless term for a specific and very human calculation. This man knows things we need to know more than we need him in a courtroom. The prosecutors kept pressing. They pressed for months and then for years, through delays and obstructions that accumulated with the patient inevitability of sediment, each one individually explicable, together devastating. The Justice Department lawyers who worked the case were not indifferent. The FBI investigators were not unmoved. The people making the arguments for accountability were making them seriously, and they knew they were losing, and they kept making them anyway. It didn't matter. Every time criminal accountability collided with intelligence value won. Every single time, without exception, across years, the outcome so consistent it stopped resembling a series of decisions and started resembling gravity. In the Salvadoran military courts, the case moved with a slowness all its own, not the slowness of incompetence, but of a system applying exactly as much friction as was needed to produce exactly the delay that was required. Rivas and Dimas sat in custody through the late 1980s, while the proceedings ground forward slowly enough that the world would lose interest long before a verdict ever came. In 1987, the Salvadoran military court dismissed the charges entirely. President Duarte overturned the ruling under American pressure, but the legal haze that settled over the case never fully lifted. American prosecutors explored bringing it into U.S. courts, a path that ran immediately into its own landscape of obstacles: jurisdiction, evidence, diplomacy. The sheer political complexity of trying foreign nationals in an American courtroom for murders committed in the middle of another country's war. Each obstacle was real. Together they formed something that functioned less like a legal problem than like terrain, the kind you can see clearly across and never quite cross. José Antonio Bolaños Rivas, alias Macias, one of the four gunmen, was never captured at all. He left behind a name, a role, and a silence that stretched forward through decades without ever breaking. Still out there somewhere or dead. The record does not know which. That was the thing that emerged when you laid it all out. Not a single act of betrayal, not one villain making one cold decision in one dark room, but a pattern, consistent and almost mechanical in how it operated. Intelligence services, prosecutors, diplomats, foreign partners, all of them pursuing different missions, all of them resolving the conflicts between those missions in the same direction, year after year. The institutions were not evil. That was the unsettling part. The CIA officers who argued for protecting assets like Andrade were not unmoved by 4 dead Marines. The prosecutors who watched the case dissolve were not cynics. The officials who made the trade-offs believed, most of them, that they were making necessary ones. that in a clandestine war against a disciplined Marxist guerrilla movement that had just murdered American servicemen at a restaurant table, the cold arithmetic of intelligence sometimes had to outweigh the warmer demands of justice. They were wrong. Or they were right. And that is worse. A decade later, Congress looked at what had happened, and the investigation that followed produced the fullest public account of how the Zona Rosa case had truly been handled. Not how it was supposed to have been handled, not how the press releases described it, but how it actually worked. In the offices, the cables, the quiet conversations between men who understood that certain things could not be written down. What the record showed was not a cover-up in any dramatic sense. No single order, no smoking cable, no moment where someone chose impunity over accountability and left a clean paper trail of the decision. What it showed was a system in which accountability was negotiated, deferred, diluted, quietly, procedurally, incrementally, with the unhurried patience of institutions that know they will outlast the urgency of any particular scandal. A system in which the question of who might be prosecuted and who might be protected was answered not by law, but by something older and more durable than law. The logic of what the war required, applied over and over until it became indistinguishable from principle. 4 Marines, murdered at a restaurant table on a Wednesday night. And in the end, the machinery built to find their killers bent toward the same imperatives that had made the killing possible in the first place. The war needed what it needed. Justice got what was left. Chapter 16. On January 16, 1992, beneath the ornate ceilings of Chapultepec Castle in Mexico City, representatives of the Salvadoran government and the FMLN signed the agreement that formally ended 12 years of civil war. The peace accords, negotiated under United Nations auspices, called for a ceasefire, the demobilization of guerrilla forces, sweeping reforms to the armed forces, the creation of a new civilian police force, land transfer measures, and the establishment of a truth commission to investigate the gravest crimes of the conflict. It was, by any reasonable standard, a historic achievement. El Salvador had endured a war that left roughly 75,000 to 80,000 people dead, uprooted hundreds of thousands more, and distorted nearly every institution in the country. Entire communities had been shattered. The economy had been stunted. Fear had become part of daily life. That the war ended not in total victory for either side, but at a negotiating table was a measure of how exhausted the country had become and of how much diplomatic labor had gone into making a settlement possible. For the FMLN, peace meant transition. Its fighters laid down their arms, and its commanders entered politics. Men who had once operated from safe houses, mountain camps, and clandestine cells now prepared to speak from podiums, run for office, and claim a place in the legal life of the Republic. Former PRTC militants, including almost certainly men who had survived the structures that produced the Mardoqueo Cruz Urban Commando, disappeared into that larger reintegration. The war, at least in its formal military sense, was over. But peace is not the same thing as reckoning. In March 1993, the United Nations Commission on the Truth for El Salvador issued its report, From Madness to Hope. It was one of the most consequential documents ever produced about the war. The commission examined atrocities committed by both the state and the insurgency, and it did so with a bluntness that unsettled the country. It named names. It described massacres, death squad killings, torture, disappearances, and executions with a level of precision that previous reports had often avoided. For many Salvadorans, the report was a necessary act of truth-telling. For many in the military and political establishment, it was an intolerable humiliation. The Zona Rosa massacre appeared in the report, but only briefly. It was treated not as a case study in itself, but as one example within the Commission's broader account of FMLN abuses. The Commission observed that the killing of the Marines reflected a larger guerrilla practice of defining certain categories of people as legitimate targets because of their real or perceived association with the enemy. In one of the report's most striking phrases, it noted that defenseless pleasure seekers became military targets, as in the case of the United States Marines in Zona Rosa. The moral point was sound. The passage captured something essential about the crime. The men at those tables had not been in combat, had not been attacking anyone, had not even been on duty. They had gone out into the city for an evening meal and were transformed, in the logic of Revolutionary War, into acceptable targets because of what they represented. Yet for the families of the dead, and for the American investigators and prosecutors who had spent years trying to assemble a case, the treatment must have felt painfully thin. The commission was writing the history of an entire war. Zona Rosa, to it, was one episode among many. To the people who had buried husbands, sons, brothers, and friends, it was not one episode. It was the wound. Then came the second blow. Only 5 days after the Truth Commission released its report, the Salvadoran Legislative Assembly passed a sweeping general amnesty law covering crimes committed during the conflict by both sides. The law was immediately controversial. Critics argued that it violated both constitutional principles and basic standards of justice. Supporters defended it as necessary to preserve the fragile peace. Whatever its legal theory, its practical consequence was unmistakable. It closed off, for the foreseeable future, the possibility of prosecuting most wartime crimes in Salvadoran courts. For the Zona Rosa case, the effect was devastating. Years earlier, in 1987, the Salvadoran government had attempted to use amnesty to shield the defendants, only to reverse course under pressure from the United States. Now, in 1993, a broader and more politically protected amnesty accomplished much the same end. The difference was that the circumstances had changed. The war was over. The peace process had become the overriding priority. Washington no longer had the same leverage, and even if it had tried to apply it, the appetite for reopening old battles in the name of one unresolved case was far weaker than it had been in the middle of the conflict. The formal Salvadoran prosecution of Rivas and Dimas effectively died there. That fact carried a bleak finality. No Salvadoran court would convict anyone for the murder of the 4 Marines killed on June 19, 1985, or for the deaths of the other victims who had been caught in the same hail of gunfire. After years of confessions, intelligence reports, diplomatic pressure, court hearings, delays, evasions, and false starts, the domestic system that had once promised justice simply stepped aside and declared the matter closed. And yet the case was not entirely dead. Under American law, the possibility of prosecution remained alive, at least in theory. The passage of time had not erased the crime, and it had not fully erased the determination of those who believed the murders should still be answered in court. The file remained open, dormant but unresolved, waiting for some event, some break, some renewed burst of public attention strong enough to drag it back into view. That moment would come in May 1995, when a television broadcast unexpectedly revived the story and forced the Zona Rosa massacre, after years of partial forgetting, back into the public eye.